London newsagents.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
And we are in the United Centre, which is normally the home of the Chicago Bulls, which Lewis is very excited about.
I'm a big fan. I love the Chicago Bulls.
The opening five, which would you say were the greatest?
Of the Chicago Bulls?
Yeah.
Well, there's obviously Michael Jordan.
And?
Well, I don't even consider anyone else. He is the sine qua non of Chicago
Dennis
Bulls
Rodman,
players.
Steve Kerr.
I mean, they're all great, but they're no Michael.
You don't know what you're talking about.
And I only know that because I saw the statue on the way in.
Well, anyway, this is now transformed into the home of the Democratic Party for the next 4 days. And the convention starts tomorrow in earnest. And we're going to hear kind of, I suspect, a very emotional speech from Joe Biden, which is his long farewell before he leaves office in January. But the transformation of what has happened to the Democratic Party in the past 4 weeks is kind of dizzying.
It is, and you can feel, I mean, we went to this sort of opening event party last night, and it was in this sort of big, right at the end in Chicago at the pier, this huge ballroom, and it was giddy. Giddy was the word, and you couldn't help but think, God, you know, if this had been taking place a month earlier and Biden had still been the nominee, the energy would have been completely different. And that is this is so far, and we'll talk a lot this week about maybe what President Harris and Harris presidency might be like, but we've been saying for a while, haven't we, the vibes of this that she has managed to embody are something else. And even being in here is a kind of remarkable experience, right? I've not been to one of these before, you have. But kind of walking into, I suppose, coming into it, and we should talk a little bit about what a convention is, but I thought it might be a little bit like a British Party conference, which I have been to so many. I mean, obviously on a bigger scale. But walking into the home of the Chicago Bulls, the arena here, it is like a party conference, but on speed, on steroids. You know, the scale of it, the scale of American politics, like where we're sat right now in this huge arena with the little stands representing all the 50 states and the US territories as well. This massive sort of dais and podium, and the convention doesn't officially start until Monday. Cliche, but the anticipation is profound. You can feel it everywhere.
So all 50 states are represented, because all 50 states will have to stand up and say, on behalf of the state of Alabama, we're right by the Alabama row of seats, New Hampshire, Kentucky, Utah,
North Dakota. I always had you down as a Bismarck man, John, in every sense.
Bismarck's a great town, actually.
Yeah, I've not been.
Bismarck, Fargo, fantastic
and a
places.
great political figure.
Yeah,
in his own right.
And the Laura sausages.
Yeah,
exactly. But now we're distracting ourselves.
Yes.
But so the convention is an opportunity for all 50 states, their delegates, to say, we support Kamala Harris. In a sense, it's not like a conventional party conference in the UK where there is debate over policy and then the motion is put and then there are votes taken and then the motion gets adopted. It's not like that. It's much more a celebration. It's much more ritualistic. It's a show. And it is run...
Well, we're sat under right now. We are sat under. We can see...
Oh, my God.
Thousands upon thousands of balloons, which, of course, will be released when Kamala Harris finishes her speech on Thursday. So, yeah, it is like everything else in American politics. So it's true showmanship.
True showmanship. So Monday, you've got Jill Biden, Hillary Clinton. Tuesday, you've got Michelle Obama, Barack Obama. Wednesday, you've got Tim Walz, her running mate. Thursday night, it's Kamala's show. Yeah. And in between time, there are going to be entertainers. And when I was at the Democratic Convention, the last one, which was in 2016, in 2020, of course, there was no convention because of COVID. You had all sorts of... Carole King was playing, Katy Perry was playing.
But that is the point. You just mentioned the sort of the running order for the week, right? And you can get the sense that Pelosi will be there as well. I mean, that is the point. This is the entire Democratic Party comes together for these quadrennial events, these once in every 4 years. Another difference with the British Party Conference is that, you know, these are unusual events. They don't happen very often. They happen like clockwork, like the presidential election, but they have a specific function, which is to nominate the president and vice president. You say, John, all of the different states are coming together. In the past, they were more dramatic in a sense that they actually would decide who the president was going to be or the vice president was going to be. It would be decided through a series of roll calls and votes, vote after vote, sometimes going into dozens and dozens of votes held. That doesn't happen anymore. There was obviously talk about a potentially contested, brokered convention this time. It hasn't happened. So what they are is a chance before the presidential election to officially nominate the nominee, which will be Kamala Harris. They agree on a party platform, which will be put to, equivalent to a manifesto really, which will be put to the voters for the presidential election. And they are huge fundraising exercises as well. The amount of money, the corporate donations, the individual donations, bringing the entire network of the Democratic Party, from the top donors, the presidential candidates themselves, the top party machine, right down to the individual delegates, is the chance for them to come together before 80 days or so away, before the big day, which is of course the presidential election in November.
So let me just say a thing about the fundraising aspect of it, because it is so important to American politics in a way that, of course, fundraising is important for the Labour Party and the Conservative Party before a general election. But the most they're going to spend is 36 million or thereabouts, I think.
Yeah, about 35.
35 million each. We are talking literally about this probably being a $3 billion campaign for each. I just looked at the ad sales that Donald Trump has booked in Georgia over the next couple of weeks, and he's probably putting out $36 million in ad sales for the next 2 or 3 weeks in one state alone. The numbers are astonishing. So I've been hearing from a couple of old friends of mine who have been doing some fundraising for the Democratic Party, hosting the people at the top of the ticket. And apparently the mood, as you say, is just extraordinary. But for all that this is a celebration and everyone's going, woohoo, we love Kamala, we love Tim. I mean, at the 2016 convention in Philadelphia, there was still huge resentment that Hillary Clinton had got it over Bernie Sanders, and there was a feeling that the Democratic Party machine had fixed it. Again, all the levers were being pulled to stop Bernie Sanders. To stop Bernie Sanders being the nominee, and so they can also be a bit ugly. These conventions, don't think it's all manicured and everything is perfectly organised. They're not.
Well, this is one of the differences still, I think, between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party now, right? Which is that, the Republican Party, in many ways, its establishment no longer exists. Trump has destroyed it. The establishment, such as it is a MAGA establishment. It's Trump, his family, his immediate associates, whoever is in the circle at that time. The Democratic Party, as we have seen in the last few weeks in particular, is not like that. It is still fundamentally a machine party, as it always has been. What do I mean by that? In the sense that it is a party where the party establishment can wield power ruthlessly, as it has done with Joe Biden. What was Nancy Pelosi doing? Nancy Pelosi, the ultimate machine politician in many ways, as her father was, who was a mayor of Baltimore. She's from a long line she has a big pedigree in the Democratic Party. She was exercising power almost like a party chairman was. And that is one of the big differences now. The Democratic Party retains its establishment. It retains its ability to wield power. It still is a much more traditional party in every sense, in a way that the Republican Party has sort of fallen apart.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting thing we should do, while we're sort of setting out what a convention is to go back 50 years, because there is kind of an element, I stress, of history repeating itself from what happened here in 1968. And the 1968 convention was also in Chicago. It came at a time of massive protests over the Vietnam War. For Vietnam War then, read Gaza protests today, and there will be enormous demonstrations. And then in 1968, we'd had LBJ, who was the president, saying, I am not running again, largely because of the unpopularity of the Vietnam War. And there was suddenly a new candidate, Hubert Humphrey, as the vice president. And all the uncertainties around that are sort of here today. It doesn't repeat itself completely, but there are striking similarities.
History doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes, right? Exactly, it is. I mean, there is some fear, even though there was an expectation that if Biden had still been at the top of the ticket, that the protests that were planned would have been at an intensity that could have been genuinely really disruptive, a la 1968. Some of the energy has gone out of that because Harris does not generate the same sort of invective and vitriol that Biden does on it. He's nicknamed now by these people Genocide Joe, right, on Gaza. But nonetheless, they are still coming, and there is a fear that, of course, that is going to, in a convention that, save for that, is going to be impeccably manicured, choreographed to within an inch of its life, as indeed the whole last few weeks of the kind of Harris bandwagon have been. That will be there, and it will be a disruptive element, and doubtless people like us will be going there and talking to them, and it reminds us that Harris still has a big job to do. She's obviously been very effective in the last few weeks, but in assembling and consolidating the Democratic coalition, which obviously is very dependent on young people. Biden had lost those people entirely, but she still has work to do on all of those scores.
I think the other lovely thing about being here in Chicago, and it's a fabulous city,
Yeah.
is in America they got rid of, the royal family. They set up a republic. It is astonishing how dynastic politics is. And in the city of Chicago, in 1968, when there were those terrible riots over the Vietnam War, and there was huge police brutality, it was orchestrated by the mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, who faced a lot of criticism afterwards for the brutal way in which the demonstrators were handled. His son Bill Daley is still around. He was Obama's chief of staff, and you see certain names that just keep recurring.
Yes.
And the Daleys are still a huge force in Chicago politics.
This is what I mean about the Democratic Party still being a machine party in so many ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And these people still have an enormous influence and sway.
I mean, the Daleys are the embodiment of machine politics, right? Machine party history. I mean,
yeah, and the governor of Illinois, so we're in the state of Illinois, is J.B. Pritzker. Go to any art gallery, go to any museum, go to whatever, and you will see the name Pritzker, because billionaire family who've also given a lot of endowment. So the relationship between money and politics, and you might think the Democratic Party is sort of more like a party of the unions in the way that the Labour Party is seen to be. No, it's a party of very wealthy donors who, have a lot of influence.
Yeah, well, indeed. And that's the thing. I mean, these conventions really matter. They are historic events. Some come and some go and are forgotten. But some linger on, live in the memory. 68 is a great example. Because American politics and the American presidency in particular is so pivotal to world events and world history, the events on which some of these days at these conventions turn have long, long-lasting effects. I mean, you mentioned 1968. Another really, really interesting convention was in 1944. Again, in this city, they always seem to be in Chicago. It's a big home of democratic politics. 1944, again, some echoes with today. Roosevelt was standing for a fourth term, obviously in the middle of the war, but everyone kind of knew, at least at the very top, public didn't know because they didn't know about the state of his health, but at the very top, the party machine, at the top of the party machine, knew who was really unwell. They could see it, right? He had advanced coronary heart disease, he was shaking all the time. He'd had polio, but they knew that this guy was not going to survive another term. A lot of people thought Biden was in the same position. So they knew that the vice presidential spot was going to be really, really important. And the guy who had been FDR's vice president, largely forgotten now, but an absolutely astonishing character, a guy called Henry Wallace, who was on the left of the party. That's why FDR had chosen to sort of broaden his appeal. But he was like a massive Soviet sympathizer. He was anti-war, he was pacifist. And honestly, the events on which kind of history, the counterfactual history, is astonishing in the sense that the party higher ups at the Democratic Party in this city decided he could not stay on the ballot. But the delegates wanted him. And so they basically, they were all calling for Wallace, saying, "Where's Wallace? Let's have Wallace, we want to vote for Wallace." And one of the big party higher-ups, sort of chairman of the party basically, prevented him from coming to the stage. They basically put a little barrier in place. And they nominated Truman instead. Yeah. And genuinely, the whole history of the world could have been different, because if Wallace had been vice president and therefore become president in 1945 when FDR died, I don't think Wallace would ever have dropped the bomb, the atomic bomb. The whole history of the Cold War would have been different. So, this is a largely forgotten story now, but it is really just reminds us that what happens in these convention halls echoes throughout the whole events and history of the world.
It's so interesting that you say that, because I think it relates to something today, and that's this. When Harry Truman did become the vice president to Roosevelt, and then takes over, of course, from Roosevelt, because Roosevelt dies, is that Truman didn't know anything about the Manhattan Project.
No.
He knew nothing about the plan to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the work that had been going on, that's kind of, we now know from the film Oppenheimer. And it was all a kind of mystery to him as he was suddenly briefed on that. Spool forward to today, and although Kamala Harris has been the vice president for the last 3.5 years, you're still quite an anonymous figure as the vice president. And so,
as it was famously said, the vice presidency ain't worth a warm bucket of spit.
Exactly. But you've got to have Kamala Harris sort of almost having to introduce herself to the American people this week.
Yeah.
Because for a long time, people have known the name Kamala Harris, Vice President. They might remember that she had an ill-fated stab at getting the presidential nomination back in 2020 and fell short by a good distance in terms of the way she prosecuted the campaign. But, although she has been the number 2 in this country for the last 3.5 years, she's still largely unknown. And she wants to define herself on her terms at this convention before Donald Trump does it for her.
Yeah, and I think that's another reason that this convention is unusually important, because Harris's position has been unusual in terms of how she got here. Very, very unusual. Nearly always, if you are your party's presidential candidate, you have gone through a primary process. That is how the party decides who their candidate is going to be. Again, another big difference between American and British politics. But obviously, because of the circumstances around Biden withdrawing, she hasn't done that. She's basically got this through acclamation. The party has just coalesced around her. Therefore, during the primary process, you would have lots of opportunity to introduce yourself to the country, to the party and all of that. As it is, she hasn't done that. And she has another unusual position as well, right? Which is that it's actually a long time since an incumbent vice president has run for president while they were vice president. Last person to actually do it was Al Gore in 2000. And so it is always a slightly unusual structural position that you have, right? If you're the incumbent vice president, how much do you distance yourself from the current administration of which you have been a part? How much do you hug it closely? All of that is quite actually a difficult thing to calibrate. And actually, because she hasn't gone through the primary process, this convention is an unusually important moment in her making those series of calibrations, and as you say, John, introducing herself to the country in a proper fashion.
Well, just one more on the comparison between the UK and the US in politics. In the US now, they are talking about this as being a sprint campaign because it's only 80 days till polling day. We've only just known that Kamala Harris is the candidate. My God, we're going to have to sprint like crazy to get to the finish line on November the 5th. Now, you might think in the UK, if you're listening to this podcast, oh my God, the last general election campaign went on long enough, and that was 6 weeks. And how can you possibly talk about this being a sprint, given that there's still 80 days to go? But in American political terms, where you've got a campaign around 50 states and you've got to get a huge machine together, it will feel like a sprint. And I think that as well, in a way, plays to Kamala Harris's advantages. We said at the start of this podcast, you said at the start of this podcast, Lewis, that the vibes have been amazing. They have been. But she's got a detailed policy, and there are still vulnerabilities. For 3.5 years, we have heard about why Kamala Harris was not a great vice president, and the problems that there were within her inner circle, and the mistrust that there was, and the backbiting that was going on, and how inside the White House, Joe Biden's team, they were very unhappy with her team, etc., etc. Since she's become the nominee, she hasn't put a foot wrong. But she's still got to be careful. There's still an awful lot of risk out there on the downside for her. And Donald Trump is trying to define her. He's come up with Comrade Kamala, which is something I'm sure we'll come back to over the coming week, about the left-wing economics policies that she's putting forward. So she's got to be careful about all of this too.
It is her party now. It is her show. This week is her show. This is when she inherits the Democratic Party. As Harry Truman said, famously, to go back to him, the buck stops here, and it will stop with her from now on. And she has 80 days to pull off that sprint, not trip up. And it is going to be the challenge, political challenge of her life, because the last 3 weeks, I think, and we can talk about this more in the coming days, the last 3 weeks have been somewhat artificial, somewhat unusual, because of the entirely weird circumstances in which she became the candidate. In a way, I think one of the stories of this week is that one way or another that will end, because the honeymoon will come to an end, and the battle will be joined properly with Trump, who it is always perennially easy to underestimate, but he's still in the game.
So we are going to be here in Chicago, in Illinois, in this fantastic arena. But we're also going to try and get out a bit, because there is a huge Gaza protest tomorrow that we're anticipating. There is talk that Kamala Harris is going to do a rally in neighbouring Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, which is, of course, where the Republicans had their convention, where Maitlis was, 3 or 4 weeks ago. And so we're going to watch out for that. And there are other stories as well around, which are going to have a big impact I think, on the way people are going to vote in November.
And I think what we want to try and do is, as we always say, lift the curtain on how this convention works. It is a spectacular, sort of dizzying event. And as I say, they only happen every 4 years. So, and as we've already discussed, historic. So we want to do that. But also, hopefully, by the time we get to the end of the week, everyone listening to this will have a better understanding of what America is trying to get a better understanding of right now, which is who Kamala Harris is. Because the vice presidency is an unusual, as we've discussed, unusual position in American politics. You are everything and yet you are nothing, or you could be everything and yet you are nothing. You're sort of there, a bit like being the, what was the phrase about Prince Philip with the Queen? You're sort of always there, but just a couple of steps behind. That is the role of the vice presidency. It's almost like a political consort, and it means that you are unable to truly reveal yourself because you are sublimating yourself to a bigger figure. That ends for her this week. So hopefully by the time we get to the end of this week, we'll have been able to show you a little bit of insight as who she is, and crucially, if she wins, what sort of president she would be for the United States and the wider world.
Well, that's what I want to talk about finally, the wider world, because, one of the things that I learned when I was a foreign correspondent, you get kind of move abroad, you were obsessed by Westminster politics, and you realise that actually what Westminster says about the world, what is the Prime Minister going to do about the situation in Gaza? Well, how much can our Prime Minister do? What the President of the United States can do about the situation. And so, I'm sure in a lot of embassies in Washington, D.C., along Massachusetts Avenue, they had written off the chances of a Biden presidency and were all buying shares in Trump Mark II. And now they are trying to reinvest again in what might the Democrats be like if they take the White House. And there are going to be an awful lot of ambassadors, I would guess, here over the course of this week.
And party officials.
And
maybe
party
from the
officials.
Labour Party, and that will be for European governments all over.
Exactly. Because what happens here does affect the rest of the world. And so it does matter for Britain, for Ukraine, for Europe, for NATO, the demeanour of Kamala Harris's national security policy and how she sees the world.
It'll be fascinating to see how Biden takes the stage and the reaction to Biden in the hall, what he says, how he addresses the fact that only a few weeks ago he thought, just the sort of personal element of that, he thought that he would be standing there as his party's nominee and not his vice president. And there are so many subplots and personal dramas and political dramas to play out this week, and it won't all be from the stage, but we'll try and get to the heart of them if we can. We're going for deep dish now, John?
Deep dish pizza, gotta be, gotta be.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the land of Lincoln.
And we'll be back later on with an episode at a more normal time when we've digested our pizzas. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.